Good day to all of you. What I would like to talk about today is the digital economy and economic development. I'm going to talk about this in the context of Africa. And the point that I'm going to try to make is how useful the digital economy can be to economic development. Before I go there, however, I would like first to give a few a few elements of description of developing countries and Africa in particular. So as you know, Africa is a very large continent. It has 54 countries, 16 of which are countries which are landlocked, which means that they don't have any access to the sea. Most of the activity is either mineral extraction or agriculture, and in many countries, those two activities are practically the entirety of the economy. A large part of the African population lives in rural areas and sometimes is quite isolated and difficult to get to. There are few means of communication within Africa, terrestrial communication, as a result of which trade between African nations and is expensive and is difficult. The climate in Africa is punishing and not always healthy, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There are drought and famines. I'm sure that you've heard about the great famines in Ethiopia a few years back, for example. The health system in Africa are fairly weak. This is first because governments have very little money. And second, it is because a lot of people live in very remote places. And thirdly, it is because the climate itself is not always very healthy. And you have certainly heard about the Ebola pandemic, for example, or now the COVID-19 pandemic, which also affects Africa. A large part of the African economy is done through informal channels, where you have informal firms which are not registered, which don't pay taxes, but also which don't have access to financial resources like bank loans exist. And I can take as examples people that you see on the street selling wares of different nature, or people working at other people's home, or a lot of traders who are in the informal economy. There are huge disparities. Africa still has a large population which is in poverty, even though the absolute amount of poor people is decreasing in Africa, but there's still quite a lot of poor people. And if we talk about the Southern Africa, what is noticeable is the fact that there are huge disparities between the well-off and the poor. And this is one of the countries in the world where there is the most widespread differentiation between poor and rich people. Finally, Africa is a continent where population grows fast. Now, if I take today's figure, for example, there are about 1.2 billion Africans, and everybody expects that by 2040, there will be about 1.8 billion Africans, which means that there will be more people in Africa than there are either in India or in China in 2040. Now, if I summarize all this, I would say that Africa has about 20% of the world's landmass, represents about 16.5% of the world population, but this is growing, as we say, and represent only 2.5% of the GDP. So that's where the underdevelopment comes in. Now, let me go through the fight against poverty and the fight in favor of development. As you know, international organizations, among others, have been trying to do something to eradicate poverty. And this has been encapsulated in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which have been established in 2015 and give a plan up to 2030. And the three pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals are the fact, first, to try to make the developing countries develop, so it's economic development first. But second, there is a second pillar, which is social inclusion, the fact that nobody should be left out of the development. In other words, that the development should benefit both the rich and the poor, and not only the rich. And three, the third pillar is environmental protection, to make sure that the economy develops in such a way that future generations will be able to develop as well. There is a particular Sustainable Development Goals, which is of interest for us, which is the fact to significantly increase the access to information and communication technologies, and to strive to provide universal and affordable access to the internet in the least developed countries by 2030. Now, we're not there yet, as we shall see, but so there is this idea that in order to improve development, in order to facilitate inclusion, and in order to facilitate sustainability, there is a need to develop and to use the technologies of information and communication. Now, what is needed for this? Well, what is needed for the development of information and communication technologies? Well, first, infrastructure. This is clear. In Africa, there is a lack of infrastructure. The estimate is that to attain the Sustainable Development Goal of reaching out to everybody and connecting everybody to the internet, the investment would be of the order of, for the infrastructure, of the order of $100 billion. And this would be necessary over a 10-year period to 2030. What would this money go for? This money would go for the deployment of 250,000 new 4G base stations. It would go towards laying 250,000 kilometers of fiber across the African region. And it would also be used to roll out satellites and Wi-Fi based solutions and other innovation to reach an estimated population of nearly 100 million in remote areas of Africa. So that's the first thing. And I must say that there are several plans. First of all, the African Union, which is the gathering of all the African countries, has a program to try to develop those infrastructures and in a coordinated way and with the financing. Second, the World Bank also has a program to try to speed up the investment in infrastructure for the internet in Africa over the next 10 years. But second, one would need skills and the development of an ecosystem. Now, skills, what does that mean? It means that one would need local specialists on internet technology, as well as the development of African relevant content for the internet. In other words, they may have different needs, they may respond to different incentives than people in other regions, and therefore there is the need to develop local content as well as education on internet. That's one aspect. The second aspect, of course, is that one should have regulations which allow the development of activities through the internet. And we're going to talk a little later on about banking, for example. The FinTechs are, in fact, telecommunication companies that develop financial services. And one of the difficulties in many countries, including in Africa, but not only in Africa, is the fact that very often the banking regulations are very strict and prevent the FinTech from getting onto the market for financial services. So one need to have a change in regulations to ensure that there's disruptive innovation that can come to the digital means can in fact access the markets. The last thing that one would need to have a favorable environment is, of course, the development of financing mechanism that would facilitate the development of startups. This means eliminating some bureaucratic hurdles when you want to create your firm, but at the same time to find money to accompany the growth of those startups. Okay, so one block is infrastructure, a second block is skill and an enabling environment, and there's a third block which is access to electricity. And electricity is needed for a range of activities, from recharging devices, for example, mobile phone, to powering mobile base stations. Now, access to electricity is quite a bit of a problem in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region of the world which has the lowest access to electricity. Only 44% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa have access to electricity, compared to 87% for the rest of the world. Okay, so we know what we need. We need good electricity, we need an enabling environment, as well as education, and we need infrastructure. And as I said, there are several plans to try to bring those things to Africa to increase the penetration of the internet. Now, what is the penetration of the internet at this point? Households with internet access at home represent about 22%. Of the population, whereas it represents something like 60% in the rest of the world. And individuals using the internet are about 24%, whereas they represent about 51% globally. So we can see that the development of the internet has not been as rapid, as fast in Africa as it has been in other countries, but there is a big push to try to develop both the infrastructure, the skills, and the enabling environment, as well as the electricity, to try to increase the penetration of the internet. Now, it must also be noted that most of the people in Africa who get access to the internet via mobile or smartphone devices, because those are quite developed in Africa. So, in Africa, we have 1.2 billion inhabitants. There are roughly, in 2020, 500 million users. And this is, by the way, the double of what it was in 2014. So it means that the internet penetration, even though it's still lower than in other regions, has grown very fast over the years. Among those 500 million users in Africa, it's noticeable that there are 120 million users of Facebook. Now, that's an interesting aspect. Why are there so many users of Facebook in Africa? Well, you have to remember that Africa is a set of countries where the population is growing very fast, and where most of the people, more than 50% of the people in Africa, are less than 20 years old. So it's a young population, very attracted towards the new technology, very attracted by the social medias. When they have mobile phones, they use them, or the young people use them to get on Facebook. So what is important for us is that there is an attraction. So far, access to the internet has been mostly through mobile phones, and there's a very high rate of growth of the population. It's more than 4% per year. So we can see that there is a huge potential and a growing potential for internet users in Africa. Now, what would be the impact of developing the digital economy in Africa? Well, there are several studies which are macroeconomic studies that I'm going to comment very rapidly. One of them is a study by the International Telecommunication Union, and it basically tells us that expanding mobile broadband penetration by 10% in Africa would yield an increase of 2.5% in the GDP of Africa, 2.5% per capita. So there would be a huge benefit. How would this benefit come? Where would it come from? Well, it would come from increased opportunities for the people who have access to the internet, better economic opportunities because they've got more information, because they can become more mobile in some way. And second, of course, there would be the jobs offered by the fact the people who actually develop the internet or develop applications for the internet. So there would be direct and indirect increase in GDP, and altogether a 10% increase in penetration would mean a 2.5% increase in GDP. This is quite important. A second thing that we learned from that study is the fact that up to now, the broadband access to internet has been quite expensive in Africa, more than in other countries, and that a decline in the price of broadband access to the internet would increase internet access quite significantly. A 10% drop in the price of mobile broadband will boost adoption of mobile technology by more than 3%. So if we succeed in lowering the price of mobile broadband, then this is going to lead to an increase in the use of broadband technology, which itself is going to increase the GDP of Africans quite significantly. So one of the goals that exists is try to bring the internet penetration in Africa up to 75% from where it is now, which could be a huge increase. And that would lead to a significant, I mean, some studies say that it would lead to a 9% increase in employment compared to what will happen if we stay at the same level of penetration. Now, this is important because we know that in Africa, one of the difficulties for many young people is to find a job. There's a huge level of unemployment, and to be able to increase employment by 9% would be a significant achievement in Africa. So the point of all this is to say that if we increase the ability of people to get access to the internet, this will increase the GDP, this will increase employment, both directly and indirectly, significantly for African countries. So now let me get down to the next level, which is the level of being more concrete and give concrete examples of digital program that could increase the welfare of Africans. The first one, of course, is education. In many remote areas, people do not have access to teachers, or if they have a school, they don't have access to books, they don't have access to information that they could use to learn the basic skills. Now, it's quite important, as we know, to improve the basic skills of people in development, and this is extremely important. This is one of the most powerful determinants of growth. So through the internet, by giving access through a tablet or even through a mobile phone to documents which can be put on the internet and that the students can look at to learn or to get informed, there could be a big boost in the level of education, particularly in the remote area, and with this, a level of skills that would allow people to have higher paying jobs and therefore a better future. Second area, we said earlier that health is a major problem in Africa. Well, again, it is the same problem in remote area in particular, and there are lots of remote area because Africa is not very dense. And as we said, communication is very difficult. So there are a lot of people who are isolated. They don't get access to doctors, or they don't get access to prescriptions, or they don't get access to the medicine that they would need, or the vaccines that they would need. Now, of course, it's easy to think that if there were applications whereby a local nurse or local doctor could be in touch with a hospital in one of the major cities and therefore get the help of specialists to diagnose a disease, that would be of considerable help to the local people. They could get the adequate medicine, so that would be a second thing. So maybe there's a need to combine the technology of digitalization with the technology of drones, which is already done, as a matter of fact. We'll talk about this a little later, to try to increase the level of health of people. By drone, you send to them all the vaccines that they need or at the time when they need it, or you send the medicine that is needed for sick people, and the diagnosis can be done remotely through the internet. Agriculture, we said that most of the countries in Africa are farming countries, and this is even more true of the remote areas of Africa. And there are plenty of problems. There are problems of floods, there are problems of anticipating droughts, there are problems of making sure that one irrigates properly the fields. And again, it's fairly easy to understand that some apps could if people have access to a mobile phone, they could, through an app, get advice or get warning about natural events that would help them increase the productivity of their farm or avoid the loss of their crops. It is also clear that through apps, farmers can get a better sense of where to sell their crop, because they may get, for example, the prices in different cities for their crop, and may be able to divert their crop to the places that have a higher price. Now, this is an information that they wouldn't get if they don't have a way to communicate with the people in those distant cities or towns. So it's clear, again, that agriculture can benefit from the digital revolution. And this is going to be hugely important for all the rural parts of Africa. Banking, one of the difficulties of development is the fact that a lot of the people do not have access to banks for various reasons. I will get into this a little later on. But at the same time, we said that already that fintechs are ways to digitally enhance the services, the banking services, particularly in remote area, and offer banking services in places where banks were not present. Trade, well, we all know about Amazon, but of course there are many other possibilities than Amazon, but trade is made much easier, both for the buyers, but also for the sellers. If the sellers want to find where potential customers are, they can easily be made through a platform. It's not very costly, and it gives a lot of information to the traders. Finally, government. We said that many of the countries in Africa have weak governmental or bureaucratic structures. This is because they don't have much money in the first place, but it is also because very often there are different groups which are in the same country, and there are difficulties of getting them to act together. There are also issues about transparency or even gathering the information about the people. So if you have poor functioning bureaucracies, a lot of the social services do not get delivered the way they could and the way they should. And again, here, the use of the digital technology can allow bureaucracies to compute, to have better data on the people, to have better definition of who is owning what, definition of property rights, better records, and possibly also an improved system of taxes where taxes are easier to get because of the digitalization of the system. So whether we talk about education, about health, about agriculture, about banking, trade, or government, it's easy to understand that some application can improve the governance of the country, or can improve the quality of life, or can improve the economic opportunities of people. I was giving an example. I was talking about the possibility of for example, improving the governance of bureaucracies. There is precisely such a program which has started in Ivory Coast and Guinea, which is called the Digital ID Project, to get records of everybody, to be able to give everybody an ID card, to know where they are, where they live, where their properties are. So this is a way to try to improve the records, which are sorely missing. And when you don't have the records, you don't get access to a lot of things, including, by the way, financial resources, because you can't prove that the land is yours, you cannot prove where you are, you cannot prove what you own, etc. Well, there's a 300 million program which has started to promote the efficiency of bureaucracy. Let me move now from areas where the digital economy can be useful to economic development to countries, to give you a couple of examples of countries which have invested quite heavily in the development of the digital economy. And the country which is probably the most advanced in this area in Africa is Kenya. Now, Kenya is, at this point, the undisputed leader of the region in terms of digitalization and development of the internet. And it has a dynamic governmental plan called Vision 2030, which aims at making Kenya the absolute leader in several areas of the digital economy by 2030. I think that the story of Kenya is quite interesting, because what started Kenya on the road to the digital economy was really the telecom operator, which was Safaricom, which is a subsidiary of Vodafone in the UK, and which created something called M-Pesa, which turned out to be hugely successful, which is a way to transfer money through mobile phones. And Kenya is a country where many people had a mobile phone, but very few people had a banking account. And all of a sudden, they were bankable, in the sense that they could have a bank account. And further, I'm going to talk more about M-Pesa as an experiment, but we'll see that M-Pesa, which started as a wallet, then expanded to many other services. This, because M-Pesa was so successful in Kenya, then it moved on to other African countries, but this gave the sense to Kenya that the digital economy could be hugely influential in developing countries, and that there could be many areas that could be invested by the digital economy. And this led the government of Kenya to try to promote the digital economy. Right now, there are about 1,500 startups in the digital economy which are active in Kenya. Some of those startups have been created by people from Kenya. Others have been created by immigrants who've decided to take the opportunity of this plan that we talked about, the Vision 2030, to try to develop apps or to develop digital platforms in Kenya. We also see in Kenya the development of a favorable ecosystem. There are still limitations associated with financing or sometimes with the qualification of the people, because in order to develop apps or to develop platforms, you need people who understand the internet, who are savvy this, and sometimes you don't find all the people who needs. But 1,500 startups in Kenya working on digital development is quite significant and makes Kenya one of the most important countries in Africa when it comes to the digital development. Another country which is embarking on the same path is Morocco, where ESSEC is located. And Morocco adopted an ambitious strategic plan of development of information and communication technologies. And it also has experienced a very strong growth in internet penetration, which, as we saw earlier, is one of the necessities. So there is a governmental plan to try to develop the skills, to develop the products, to develop the platforms for African use in Morocco. There is an ecosystem in Morocco with quite a lot of startups. It's not quite as favorable as the one in Kenya, not because, in a sense, there is less problem of getting access to people who are educated, who are savvy in digital matters. So that's not a problem. Mobile penetration is quite significant in Morocco, so that's not a problem. Where there is a problem is there is more of a bureaucracy, which makes it difficult to establish a startup or and a banking system, which is not very responsive to the needs of young and growing firms. So it's more the financial and administrative parts of the ecosystem which make it difficult for firms to prosper in Morocco. But there's the same desire to make Morocco a hub for the internet by facilitating the development of startups in this country. Now, I have taken areas where the digital developments can be useful. I've taken countries which have decided to have, I could have spoken, by the way, about other countries. Ghana is one, but I cannot talk about all the countries. I want now to talk about a few success stories to give you a sense of what businesses actually made a success of themselves. Now, I talked earlier about M-Pesa. Now, as I said, M-Pesa was created by Safaricom. Safaricom is a subsidiary of Vodafone in the UK, and it's also the dominant telecom operator in Kenya with 77% market share. So that's huge. Now, it means that there are Safaricom offices everywhere in Kenya, and the idea was to use the digital technology, given the fact that everybody had access to mobile phone and that they were representatives of Safaricom all over Kenya, to create a way for people to exchange money, to receive money or to pay money. And the whole idea was to say, well, you go to your local Safaricom operator and he opens an account on your mobile phone, and you deposit money on this this account, which you give to the Safaricom representative. And this means that on your mobile phone, you have an account and you can use your mobile phone to transfer some of this money to someone else who has an account. So you can send money to your grandmother, or you can receive money, which, by the way, is quite important in Africa, because you have to remember that in many countries, including in Kenya, many Africans live abroad and send money home. This is one of the major resources of those countries, remittances. And through the mobile application, you can receive money from abroad as well as use your money. So the idea was to create digitally a wallet that people could have, and so they would not have to carry cash, which means that it is safer for them, but also it's much easier to transfer money. They don't have to go to a bank, which is there, and which is going to be very difficult for most people in the rural areas. Now, the people in the rural areas vis-a-vis banks had two problems. First of all, in many areas, there are no banks around, so you have to travel long distance to go to the bank. But second, to open an account in a bank, it's quite difficult. For example, in most banks in Kenya, you needed to have a minimum deposit to open your bank account. Now, most people did not have that much money, whereas with the mobile wallet, if you have 2 cents, you can open an account. That's fine. And you can then send 1 cent if you want very easily to someone else. You don't have to have a minimum amount. Now, what happened is that this became hugely successful, and everybody uses it now in Kenya and in several other countries in East Africa. But at the same time, M-Pesa itself, which is the division of Safaricom, which is dealing with this mobile wallet, has become quite huge. In fact, the revenue of M-Pesa are now larger than the revenue of Kenya in general. So they're larger than the GDP of Kenya. And Safaricom has used this space to move into other service, not only the wallet, which was at the origin, but now you can also subscribe a loan digitally through 2 services called M-Shwari and KCB M-Pesa. So there is an enlarged banking facility because you can borrow money. You can, M-Pesa has also invested in program to bring solar power to off-the-grid citizen, people who are out of the way, they don't have access to the electricity grid. Why? What's the interest of Safaricom? Safaricom likes people to have access to electricity so they can charge their mobile phone and use them. Okay, so M-Pesa went into offering money for people to get access to electricity through off-grid means, and therefore allows you to invest in small generators or in small cell systems with a development which is called M-Kopa. So they lend you the money so that you can have the electricity which you're going to use with your mobile phone, basically. There are a number of projects that M-Pesa started for farmers to help them anticipate what the weather is going to be like, to anticipate what the irrigation should be, and so on and so forth. As well, so that's called DigiFarm, and there is an application for healthcare and one for education. Finally, M-Pesa launched its own e-commerce website, which is called Masoko, and which is a little bit like Amazon. It launched a messenger app called Bonga, and which is competing with Facebook, and even a taxi service, a little bit like Uber, which is called Little Cab. And this is how M-Pesa grew, using the mobile, because all of those things can be accessed through the mobile phone, and developing internet services thanks to the coverage of internet, which is quite wide in Kenya. Let me talk about another successful example, which is called Jumia. And Jumia is the African Amazon. What is interesting is that it didn't start in Africa, really. It was created by 2 Frenchmen who were former consultants for McKinsey. And it was the first startup of the African continent to achieve the status of unicorn. In other words, to have a valuation which is now larger than $1 billion. So that means that, and you have to remember that Jumia was created in 2012. So in 8 years, it grew considerably. It is now present in 15 African countries, including Nigeria, which was its original place, and which is still its largest market, because Nigeria is a very populous state, which has 200 million inhabitants. Now, what was the idea? I mean, Jumia offers all kinds of products like clothes, shampoo, drinks, appliances, car accessories. But the particular, the specificity of Jumia is that the offering is specialized towards an African set of consumers. In other words, it offers the products or the services that Africans would like, which is not exactly the same than the, it offers, for example, the successful African brands that people recognize more than it does the classical brands that we all know about. Now, Jumia started as like Amazon, as a platform offering products, and then it expanded. It has a home delivery service called Jumia Food, so it can deliver food to people locally. It has a booking platform for hotels and airline tickets in Africa, and which is called Jumia Travel, and which federates now 25,000 establishments in Africa. And finally, Jumia is not only a place that sells goods and services, but is also a place where independent sellers can offer their services. Now, that is quite important because a lot of those independent sellers had no way to find customers because of the difficulty of moving to Africa. And a lot of them were in the informal sector. And by expanding their economic opportunities, it gives them a huge impetus to try to become formal. So we now have on Jumia, as I said, 50,000 independent traders offering their products, as well as the products which are sold by Jumia itself. So this is an African Amazon. Usually it developed very rapidly, very successfully, and is now a very major firm. Let me take a last example, which is called Pedigree. And this is an anti-counterfeiting app. As we said earlier, health is a problem in Africa, and there are various reasons. Lack of hospitals is one of the problems. Lots of epidemics is another problem. And the third one is the fact that people are very poor and they tend to buy the cheaper drugs that they can find because very often they don't have somebody paying for those medicine. They have to pay them themselves. As a result, there is a huge trade in Africa of counterfeited drugs. And some of those counterfeited drugs are really quite dangerous to the health of people. So there is a need to try to control this market, but it's very difficult because we're talking about remote pharmacies or remote places where it's very difficult for a farmer, for example, who doesn't really know how to read, to decide what is the genuine medicine and what is the counterfeit medicine. And there are people there trying to take advantage of the sick and the poor. So what is Pedigree? Pedigree is an organization which was founded in 2007. Again, it's fairly recent. And they run a mobile telephony platform where on the one side, you have all the people who have access to mobile phone. And on the other side, you have a central registry where in Pedigree information of product brands of the real drugs is put by pharmaceutical companies. So you have pharmaceutical company on one side, and they are putting the specification of the real drugs on a registry. And on the other hand, this registry can be accessed by anybody who has access to the mobile phone, mobile network in Africa, and by the way, also in Asia. Now, the Nigerian pharmaceutical companies, for example, formed a consortium to put information on this registry with the help of the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, which is the part of the Nigerian government in charge of health. And starting in 2009, they rolled out a service for all the medicines in Nigeria. So it's very easy for people when they go to a pharmacy to know whether a medicine which is offered to them is genuine or a fake, counterfeit medicine. You can take your mobile phone, call this app, and see whether what is on the registry matches what you find in a pharmacy. It's now, and Pedigree is now present in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, and it's in the process of entering Uganda, Tanzania, and South Africa. So it's expanding quite a bit. So this is an example of a very useful app for Africans to help them in the health sector. Finally, FinTech. We've talked about M-Pesa, but there are other FinTechs in Africa. And what's interesting about those FinTech in Africa is the fact that some of them use artificial intelligence to create a credit score for people. People who've never borrowed money because they don't have enough revenue to be able to borrow money. All of a sudden, they need to borrow money. If they go to the bank will say, you have 0 credit score, you do not have a collateral, I'm not going to lend you money. What those FinTech do is they use artificial intelligence programs that monitor what this person has been doing with their mobile phone. And the mobile phone gives a lot of information about what has been bought, what financial transactions they've entered into, where they've gone. And using this information, those FinTech try to create a credit rating for those people and offer them financial services according to their credit rating. Later on, I will talk briefly about one of those FinTechs. So the origin of this is really a firm which was created in London, but which was created for Africa, called Jumo, created in 2015. And that firm wanted to reimagine finance in emerging markets. And that's how they got the idea that they could, with the help of artificial intelligence, try to get credit scores and allow small loans. And a typical example of a loan would be a poultry farmer in Zambia, and the poultry farmer has to buy seeds, but may not have all the money available to buy the seeds for the next crop and need a loan for that. And that is where Jumo will come in and look at what we know about this person through the artificial intelligence examination of his record and decide whether that person is worth giving a loan to. Or it could be in Kenya, for example, an Uber driver who needs to have a car to become an Uber driver, and therefore he needs a loan to buy the car. And again, Jumo will extend a credit to that person depending on that person's credit rating based on intelligence artificial analysis of data on this person. Now, let me finish by saying that what we've seen is that there is a huge potential of development for the digital economy in Africa. And of course, this hasn't gone unnoticed by the big players in the field. Google and others have started investing usually in Africa at different levels. For example, if I take Google, in 2019 announced the implementation of a new submarine cable called Equiano, which goes from Cape Town all the way to Lisbon, and which will equip 9 countries on the way. And the technology used by Google for this cable will provide for a better high-speed connection with a lower consumption of energy compared to existing technologies. So this is the first level. Then, of course, those countries which will have access through the cable to a high-speed connection will have to install the next mile, or which is the terrestrial equipment, and finally to connect to the people. But at least to get the high-speed connection at the international level, it will be done at a lower cost of electricity. So it is both compliant with the desire to be to save on electricity. It is useful for the countries because they don't have much electricity, and it also provides those countries with high-speed connection. So it's sustainable, helps the development, and of course helps Google because Google can sell services in Africa. The second area where Google is invested in Africa is precisely in an artificial intelligence lab. Google decided to open one of those labs to answer the socioeconomic, political, and environmental needs and challenges of the continent. Now, what I want to say is to give you a sense of how can artificial intelligence be useful in Ghana, for example. Well, in Ghana, you have people speaking different languages, and many of them have official documents in their local languages, but those are different from other countries, and they may be different from different regions. Now, artificial intelligence, we know, has helped us develop Google Translate, for example. Well, Google Translate can be adapted to those circumstances so that the official documents of people will be read or all over the country and across several countries in Africa, even though the languages are different. So voice recognition could be also very useful to help people communicate. So there are plenty of applications of that, but there are also applications which are, I would say, more classical of artificial intelligence, which is, for example, reading satellite images, analyzing them to predict phenomena such as drought or floods, or even the possibility of good crops or bad crops. So Microsoft is a second GAFAM which has invested in Africa. And last year it created its first data center in Johannesburg. In other words, a cloud, which is a cloud specific for Africa. Now, up to that time when business firms in Africa wanted to use the cloud to store their data, they had to go to a platform in Europe or in the US, because that's where the platforms were, and to analyze this data or use the data they had stored, they were resorting to European or North American firms, which were offering those services. The idea of Microsoft is to create a cloud locally in order to develop local services so that African firms can feel secure. They can regain some national sovereignty or some continental sovereignty on their data. They don't have to send those data to Europe. They don't have to send those data to the US. And they will find the ecosystem that will help them use the local cloud to develop local services for a cheaper price than the price that the African firms had to pay when they were resorting to European or North American firms. Now, this could be particularly useful, by the way, to store the data, the governmental data. For example, if you run the tax office of a country, you may want to put all this data on a cloud, and then to have access and enter into treatment of this data in order to make your tax service actually function. Okay, so this is where it could all be done locally in Africa. And as I said, Microsoft, which is one of the specialists of cloud computing, has set up a cloud in Africa. Let me talk about the last one, which is SAS. Now, I don't know whether you know SAS, but it's the #1 artificial intelligence company in the world. And it is also a company that deals with advanced analytics software. And it announced that it will invest $1 billion over the next 3 years on the African continent mostly to train African human resources on artificial intelligence and all the related topics in order to contribute to the economical development of the continent. Now, what's the idea there is to use artificial intelligence, which is very useful to get closer, for example, to knowing consumers, but to do it from Africa with an African perspective in order to better understand the African consumers rather than consumers in general. Now, for this, you need people who are trained in artificial intelligence and who are able to develop tools using artificial intelligence. And of course, you need local data. So that goes very well with the previous example that we saw of Microsoft developing a cloud, an African cloud. SAS is going to do, just like Google and Microsoft, is going to associate itself with 10 universities in Africa, develop partnership, and offer free software licenses and tools to the students to develop artificial intelligence tools. Let me conclude. I hope I have convinced you, first of all, that the digital tools could be extremely useful to contribute to economic development, particularly in developing countries, through the treatment of information and the dissemination of information. And this means that there is a huge potential for the development of internet and the digital instruments in Africa in particular. And as we saw, many countries have seized on this opportunity. Many firms have started exploiting this opportunity, and there is a very vibrant scene in Africa in the digital world. Now, all this is going to be considerably useful to anybody who is interested from the business side in the development of the internet, and also from the development side for those who are interested in development. So it's an excellent match. It is not entirely perfect. There are still, we saw in the ecosystem, sometimes some difficulties to find adequate financing, even though the digital technology itself helps the financing develop. But what we see is a vibrancy and a mushrooming of initiatives and ideas, which is going to be one of the really interesting developments of the next few years. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I hope that if you go into the ESSEC program, you will develop both your interest in the digital economy, but also the ability to apply it to developing countries. Thank you very much, and goodbye.